Well, good evening and welcome to the Kansas City Public Library. I'm Henry Fortunato, Director of Public Affairs. A brief housekeeping note before we begin. For those of you who are veteran library programming attendees, you know that when we have an event down here in Kirk Hall, it means that we won't be stamping the parking coupon. It means that the gates are wide open, so nothing to worry about. Unless, of course, you had a role in the financial crisis of 2008. In which case, we're going to make you pay through the nose. Well, let's open tonight's program with a reading from the Gospel according to Dean Starkman. It's in the beginning of chapter 3 of Dean's new book, The Watchdog That Didn't Bark, The Financial Crisis and the Disappearance of Investigative Journalism. In 1932, the Wall Street Journal ran a story datelined San Francisco that began like this. 5 years ago, Oliver Twining rarely was early for work. As the chairman of the Pacific Bank and Trust Company, Mr. Twining regularly strolled into his office 20 minutes late. Rank has its privileges, he would explain. Today, however, Oliver Twining is rarely late for work. Now self-employed, he operates 14 hours a day on the corner of Church and California streets, shouting, "Apples for sale." Oliver Twining is just one of many former bankers trying to piece their lives together in the wake of the 9,000 bank failures in the last 3 years. The lead is catchy today. In 1932, it was startling. I don't remember reading all that many newspaper stories like that 5 or 6 years ago when the Great Recession hit. Indeed, it seems like it was just the opposite for some of those people, but I digress. And speaking of things I don't remember from 2008 and several years prior, I also don't recall reading all that many newspaper stories suggesting that a crisis emanating from a corruption of the financial system was about to hit us like a tsunami. So, why is that? How come the business press didn't provide fair warning of what was ahead when it could have made a difference? How come, in other words, the watchdog didn't bark? In Dean Starkman's telling of it, the professional press let us down. It's a failure that coincided with another crisis, the devastation of the traditional news business. In combination, the result was a deafening silence that left most of us completely unprepared. Dean Starkman examines this and much more in his new book, The Watchdog That Didn't Bark. There is some history tracing the beginnings of investigative or muckraking journalism and the evolution, or perhaps more accurately, the devolution into what we now watch on CNBC. There's also a lot of great inside dope about the journalism game. For example, the difference between access reporting and accountability reporting, and how the first results in little more than glowing profiles, while the second gives us penetrating probes that help us get closer to the truth. Dean says we need less of the former and a lot more of the latter. Our guest tonight is supremely suited to take on this task, the task of diagnosing these problems and prescribing some solutions. He's a 30-year veteran journalist. He was a reporter for the Wall Street Journal and was also part of the team that won a Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting for the Providence Journal. Currently, he's an editor and the Kingsford Capital Fellow of the Columbia Journalism Review, as well as a fellow for the Investigative Fund of the Nation Institute. At the beginning of his book, Dean writes that his message is meant for what the eminent historian Richard Hofstadter once called the literate citizen. He must have been thinking of the audience that we regularly attract to the Kansas City Public Library. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dean Starkman.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Howard. Thanks very much, Howard, for that great introduction. I have two mics. What should I do with this one? Move it away. Oh, great. Thanks for being the gaffer. Actually, Howard jokes, but yeah, this is the audience that I actually had in mind when I wrote The Watchdog That Didn't Bark, and this is exactly what Richard Hofstadter had in mind when he wrote that The Age of Reform back in the 1950s. I've been on a book tour. I've been in Toronto and Boston and New York. I'll be going back to New York. But I was very much looking forward to being here for a couple of reasons. One is part of my book deals with the muckrakers, and muckraking was actually a middle American, middle class, middle American, Midwestern phenomenon. This was the audience for McClure's magazine, the great muckraking standard that started the muckraking movement, and it was really in the Midwest that this great journalism movement sort of took hold. Number one. Number two, I'm delighted to be here at the invitation of a public library. You know, it sounds like they have events like I'm like a dime a dozen. They have events like this 2 or 3 times a week. And I was like put up with a limo and a hotel, and and he said, this is standard procedure, and I really feel like, I hope people don't think that this goes on all over the country. It's a very unique institution, really a unique institution, and I'm big on public institutions, and it's really a barometer of the health of the community that really supports this library and the citizens that can come out and do it. So, enough of all of that. But I do want to thank Bradley Kemper and Courtney Lewis and Todd Boyer and Howard for being such great hosts. Okay. All right. So I'm going to talk about this book, and then I would like to engage. If you have any questions, I'd like to engage them afterward. I was, as I said, I've been going around talking about this book, and the first stop was in Boston. It was at a conference at Northeastern University, organized by students, and all of them European students. They're business students, and they wrote this about their conference and what they hoped to accomplish. They said they wanted to capture and summarize a phenomenon that started in the financial sector and spread throughout the economy and infected every part of society like a virus. We believe the crisis marks an unprecedented turning point in the history of modern capitalistic society. This complex event and its consequences will continue to be studied for many years and will continue to transform our society. We're living through them, and we don't want to wait 20 years to understand them. So I thought this was pretty, I couldn't have said it better myself. I thought this was pretty good for business school students particularly, and I thought it was interesting that they were European, because in Europe, youth unemployment is extremely high, and we all, in a sense, and just sort of talking with people around here, in a sense, we're all sort of living through and with this crisis. So, the book is called The Watchdog That Didn't Bark, The Financial Crisis and the Disappearance of Investigative Journalism. It's not meant to be subtle, and I am going to be describing what I see as a pretty significant journalism failure. It was published in January, and I've had a few months to sort of step back and reflect about it. When I think about it, I started to think about this book. There was a lot of arguments between me and others who were in the professional press about their role in all of this. And there was, some bitter words and some anger. But now we're sort of past that, and I started to, I think we are, and I started to think about this as actually more of a problem of not just journalism, but of information in general. So I came across this story. Let's see if I can make this work. Answer, no. Wonders of technology. Sarah? Excuse me. Sure. There you go. All right. Voila. So I came across this story. It was in the Wall Street Journal in February. This is an account of the minutes that were released of the Federal Reserve Board during the crisis period of 2008. So now we get to see behind the scenes, like what people were saying and who was saying what about the crisis during the spring and fall of 2008. And as you can see, the journal sort of splits it up between winners and losers. Tim Geithner, a loser. William Dudley, one of the Fed governors, a winner. What was interesting about this is basically is who kind of had a sense, who had an inkling of what was about to happen. And what was interesting about this is that even the winners, Bill Dudley and Janet Yellen and other people who later were sort of vindicated in their views, really groping around in the dark. I mean, these are people at the epicenter of the financial system with access to all the data. And they didn't know. When you see what their conversations were, I was reading the minutes, it's sort of some grimly amusing. Quote, "I tend to look at financial markets as being the canary in the coal mine," said Fed Governor Frederick Mishkin during one April 30th discussion. In this case, he said, "The canary has not keeled over." Tim Geithner chimed in, "I don't think the canary is wheezing." And Ben Bernanke eventually concluded, "I think the canary is still getting decent breath here." So we're looking at people essentially groping in the dark about what was going on in not just the financial system, but particularly in a key market, the subprime mortgage business. Actually, and I looked up, this is of course the seat of Kansas City Federal Reserve, and Thomas Hoenig was the Fed governor then, and just to put it kindly, I don't think he would be listed among the winners in the debate back then. He was worried about inflation. But and if you're sort of talking about winners and losers, of course the biggest loser was Alan Greenspan. Right, I mean, here was the chairman of the Federal Reserve, and what was interesting about Greenspan, the thing to remember about him, is besides being a very celebrated economist, his main specialty is housing. He was an expert on housing, and he was a voracious consumer of information and data. So you sort of think about it, and again, it wasn't as if he used to literally read about housing data in the bathtub. And yet he didn't know. And you know what's significant for me was, and one of the things we have some bankers, I guess, in the audience, and maybe we'll get some. It's all right, and we have journalists up here, so it's not that I don't have anything to say, but I think we kind of can agree, right? Or maybe we can't, and we can discuss it afterward, that the problem started in, at least, if it didn't center on the subprime mortgage market. Yes? Okay. And if you sort of look at, the market really didn't exist in any significant fashion before the early 90s. Really, it was a tiny business. And if you see at the end of this spectrum, it became a quarter of the market. And if you add other non-prime products called Alt-A and other such, more than half the U.S. mortgage market, multi-trillion market, was non-prime. So I think we all can agree there was something wrong with this picture. I just made this chart of collateralized debt obligations. You don't have to know what those are, but those are securities made from the very mortgages you just saw. And just to round out the picture, credit default swaps are insurance policies on the two things you just saw, right? And all of those, but what's important, I think, for our purposes, is it all goes back to the subprime mortgage market. It started there. And I think it's fair to say that, I'm going to use a very heavy word, but if we have to work with this word, but it's fair to say there was corruption in this market. And I hesitate to use it because it's a very hot word, but I want to use it at least in the secondary definition, according to Merriam or Webster or one of them. And the way they describe it is, it's a process by which something is changed from its original use or meaning to one that is regarded as erroneous or debased. So it's changed. The mortgage market changed. Okay, that's sort of where we start. And what we see from the original from these minutes of the Fed meeting was that people, again, at the center of the system didn't know, but some people did know. And some of them were journalists. And here's our problem. So there was one piece that was 6,000 words, published in a small periodical called Southern Exposure, published in Durham, North Carolina. It said this: a 7-month investigation by Southern Exposure has uncovered a pattern of predatory practices within Citigroup's subprime units. Southern Exposure interviewed more than 150 people, borrowers, attorneys, activists, current and ex-employees, and reviewed thousands of pages of loan contracts, lawsuits, testimony, and company reports. The people in the documents provide strong evidence that Citi's subprime operations are reaping billions in ill-gotten gains by targeting the consumers who can least afford it. And what's interesting about this piece, written by a guy named Mike Hudson, was that it was published in the summer of 2003. And here's another thing that blew my mind when I came across it. It's called American Nightmare: The Predatory Lending and the Foreclosure of the American Dream. Richard Lord. No one's heard of this book, and no one's heard of Richard Lord. He's now a reporter for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, but at the time he was a reporter for a paper called the Pittsburgh City Paper, an alternative weekly. And he started to notice, he's an urban affairs reporter, had no financial reporting experience at all. And he started to notice that in his neighborhoods he was covering, there was an alarming spike in foreclosure rates. And he looked around the country and found that the same was true in other cities. Pittsburgh, of course, it started there, but Newark, Cleveland, Chicago, etc. And it's interesting. And he was able to write this paragraph. Oh, and what's interesting about Richard Lord was he was meeting the people who were having their homes foreclosed, and he was able to trace the problems back to the funding sources. And of course, the funding source was on Wall Street. Now, how was he able to do this? Well, Richard Lord was a young guy, he was like 28 at the time, and he posed as a student and snuck into the University of Pittsburgh Business School library and logged on to and taught himself how to use a Bloomberg terminal. And he was able to trace the subprime mortgage market to the securities market that was funding it, called mortgage-backed securities, and was able to document this giant rise in this market. And he was able to write this: by its very nature, the mortgage-backed securities market encourages lenders to make as many loans as at high an interest rate as possible. That may seem a prescription for frenzied and irresponsible lending, but he wrote essentially that in the prime market I think most of us are in, that was tempered by the fact that people have choices and that the products are basically plain vanilla. These are 30-year fixed mortgages. He says, but those brakes don't apply as well in the subprime lending market, where regulation is looser, marketing more freewheeling, and customers less savvy. And the interesting thing about this book was that it was published in December of 2004. And it was based on reporting he had done in 2002 and 2003 for his paper. And remember, I like to move around a little bit. I hope you guys. He's reporting here when it was here, and the book was written here, and the party hadn't gotten started yet. So that's what I found. To me, this is our problem, our problematics, if you will. So why did I write this book? Number one, the crisis. Number two, this was something that was entirely man-made. Number three, it occurred on a central beat of American journalism. And four, of course, it took everyone by surprise. The public, of course, the press also, but again, even the people at the very center of the financial system. So what I wanted to do, I was sort of describe this, when I see as a journalism failure, and put this failure in some kind of historical context. So you could ask, so right, why am I writing about muckrakers and this lady, Ida Tarbell, in a book about the financial crisis of 2008? Well, the answer is that Ida Tarbell and the muckrakers faced the exact same journalism problem that our contemporaries faced a century later. That is to say, how do you explain a complex problem to a mass audience? That was the problem she faced, and that was the problem our compatriots faced. And when we talk about mass audience, we're talking about us, all of us. The problem was, in her day, was industrial consolidation, monopoly. In our day, it's financialization. Both of those problems have been brewing for 20 or 30 years. And in her case, this was the target. So she wrote something called The History of the Standard Oil Company. It was a 19-part series in a magazine called McClure's. Again, sold like, this was a phenomenon, sold like hotcakes around the country, especially in the Midwest among middle-class people. And for many of them, it was really a revelation, because they had all been concerned about how did a handful of people come to control important sectors of the economy. This John D. Rockefeller controlled 90% of the oil market, but the beef market, the sugar market, the steel market were all similarly held by what we would now call oligarchs. And it was her series that essentially not just triggered an antitrust suit that eventually led to the breakup of Standard Oil, but it really energized an entire movement that led to, in some ways, the transformation of society. So the important thing to remember about the Tarbell series and why it's relevant to us today is it took forever, it took years. She started it in 1901, it was finally finished in 1904. It cost like $2 million in today's dollars. It involved extensive and expensive document hunts. It was meticulously documented, and really, what it did was sort of set the template. This is the standard when we talk about what we're looking for. This was the standard, and the result was she was put on a postage stamp. Those were the days when journalists were put on postage stamps. But she became a national hero, and for good reason. Now, what was interesting, again, for our purposes, is at the exact same time that Tarbell was essentially inventing a new form of journalism, basically let's call it the investigative narrative, or the long-form expose, or whatever, what have you. A new form of journalism was emerging, and that was what we conventionally call business news. Exactly around the same time, people named Charles Dow and Edward Jones were getting together to form a company called Dow Jones that would publish the Wall Street Journal. And it was eventually bought by this guy, Clarence Barron, who started the magazine Barron's that still exists today. What's important to understand about business journalism in its early days, and why it matters, is that business journalism has started its roots. The point of it was basically it was a messaging service between markets. They were started as small wirehouses around the New York Stock Exchange, and they would employ literally young boys who would run back and forth with pieces of paper between corporations with their news about dividends and stock splits and earnings and all that to the market and back. And Dow Jones's main advantage was it was faster than everybody else. What's important to understand about the roots of business news, why I spent a chapter worrying about it, is that it had basically there were two elements that are sort of core practices that are key to successful business news operations. One is speed, right? Even then, seconds mattered. And the second is access to powerful people who have the information. Clarence Barron is considered a founding father of U.S. business journalism. He's sort of a comical character in some ways. He's grotesquely fat and imperious, and he would followed by 2 or 3 male secretaries who scribbling down his every word. But he was actually also a great journalist, but in a very particular way. His sources were the powerful, the Tsar of Russia, the Kaiser, and this guy, Charles Mitchell, who was the president of National City Bank, which is the Citigroup predecessor, identified later as being one of the significant figures involved in the crash of 1929. In National City was a big lender to retail stock buyers. They borrowed money to buy stock, and this was the result. And of course, we know what happened there. So, just to bring it forward, the 2 elements that are at the heart really of business news: access and speed. And again, business news, I used to practice it. I was in it for at least 10 years, and it's filled with amazing journalists. But this DNA, if you will, has played a big role in what was to come. So it's safe to say that the short version of my book is that there was no Ida Tarbell right in 2003, as there was in 1903. That's the short version. Of course, the long version is that, as we know, and I think people here are probably readers of business news, of course there's an ocean of material about mortgage lending and about Wall Street banks. And I read a lot of it. We did a study of it at the Columbia Journalism Review for an article that was published in 2009 to sort of settle the argument of what was and wasn't written. And when you read all of this material from 9 publications over 7.5 years, what you see is, one thing you're struck by is it's all factually accurate, down to the letter. If there's a mistake, okay, it's corrected. But basically, we're talking about vastly, almost 100% factually correct. And second, it's actually very interesting, even today, to read it. But the problem is, it's entirely irrelevant to the problem that was brewing. And I think when we're kind of working through this problem, of why were we all surprised, we have to actually look at the text of what was published, because when we talk about literate citizens or illiterate citizens or just people, the only way, really the way most of us are going to connect to complex and big, powerful institutions like financial institutions is through journalism, unless we happen to be in the business. But I think I'm not wrong in saying that. Even today, with bloggers and a lot of data online and all this other stuff, if we really want to know, right, about something that's happening in Washington or on Wall Street, typically most of us will get it through journalism. So let's look at a couple of, and I think you'll get a sense of what I'm talking about. I want to look at, this is Jamie Dimon, who's the head of J.P. Morgan. I just like the cover. He wasn't the worst actor at all in this. They did buy Wells Fargo and Bear Stearns and a lot of problems, and it's too big to fail and all of that. But the point is that I think the cover, the Fortune cover from 2006, kind of gives off the ethos of what we're talking about. This is the kind of thing. But let's look at. I want to look at Lehman Brothers coverage, and I suspect or I assume that everyone knows what happened to Lehman Brothers. But if you don't know, there'll be a surprise at the end of this. Okay. Here's, again, I want to say, obviously, what we found were, as I think I demonstrate in the book, things that you could actually, that would actually qualify as warnings were, of course, few and far between. But I want to also say that it was even the convention coverage, far from like warning people, even when it was doing its job as reporting on these banks from an investor's perspective, was actually contributing to the frenzy that would lead to the crisis. And I'll explain in a second. But if you look at like January 2004, there's a Business Week story that ran a story on the rising fortunes of Lehman Brothers because, as the story said, it was diversifying away from its roots as a bond trading house and into investment banking and other services. The lead proclaimed, under CEO Fuld, that's Dick Fuld, the bond house has become a deal-making power. The story starts with an anecdote designed to show Dick Fuld's relentless personality. It was late December, but the holidays were not on the mind of Lehman Brothers Inc.'s chairman and CEO, Richard S. Fuld Jr. In 2003, Lehman had catapulted ahead of a slew of Wall Street rivals to become a serious investment banking power, and Fuld was not letting up. On his desk, next to a tall Starbucks mocha frappuccino, was a list of hundreds of banking clients. He was determined to reach every person by New Year's Day. Quote, "When something is on my list," he says, "it will get done." Now this is obviously represented, fairly typical, business press profile. These are usually carefully negotiated between the news organization and the bank with investor relations and PR people to get this thing. And again, it's actually a very interesting story, and it didn't turn out to be quite right in terms of what it was saying. Oh, Lehman Brothers is diversifying away from bonds into something else. It's not a fault, and that was what their strategy was. It just didn't turn out that way. But let's just grant that it was accurate, all right? I mean, for the moment. And it's interesting, if you look back over this material, you'll see, like, this was Business Week. That was Business Week. You'll see that the same story is kind of recycled through various news organizations, and they kind of more or less do variations on the same theme. And here's the second one. This is in October 2004, so like 10 months later. Wall Street Journal, 2,400-word page one story. Similar premise under this headline. Trading up. To crack Wall Street's top tier, Lehman gambles on going solo. Firm built on bonds expands without seeking a merger. Investment banking is key. No new gorilla for Mr. Fuld. The gorilla reference was to a stuffed gorilla he used to keep, Dick Fuld kept in his office until the 9/11 attacks, and after that he decided it wasn't appropriate to have toy animals, so a little humanizing detail. But that's sort of where we were at. And then, again, that was October 2004. And then, finally, even in April 2006, Fortune runs another story, again on Fuld and Lehman. And this is the headline. The improbable power broker, how Dick Fuld transformed Lehman from Wall Street also ran to super hot machine. And so the story goes on and talks about its financial performance, which in fact was fantastic, which is sort of one of the interesting paradoxes of this period. So it says, consider this, when Lehman went public in 94, it had only $75 million in earnings, paltry return on equity of 2.2%, et cetera, et cetera. Now it's $32 billion in earnings, 3.2 in revenue, 3.2 billion in profits, hit 19.4 in return on equity, et cetera, et cetera. It's over the past decade, Lehman stock is up 29% per annum on average, highest of any major securities firm and 16th best among the Fortune 500. It's interesting. The story does, at this point, note that Lehman remains highly dependent on the bond business. Now, bonds, in our case, just wait for the punchline, but bonds, in our case, means essentially products based on subprime mortgages during this period. But it says, we know we told you they were going away from bonds, but here it says, Fuld's magic has been in part to ignore doomsday predictions that Lehman was too focused on bonds. Instead, he chose to exploit that area of strength, building the firm into a fixed income juggernaut and benefiting mightily from the seismic decline in interest rates for the past decade. Today, Lehman derives 48% of its revenue from fixed income. And that's sort of as far as you can, my point only is this, that's about as far as you're going to get with that perspective. And you're looking at Wall Street from profit-centered point of view within this narrow frame, and you will be absolutely right. Like, everything they say is correct. Their return on equity was 19.4%. Guaranteed that's right. I haven't checked it, but I know it's true, right? And yet, again, it's not helping us understand like what is coming. And I couldn't resist this one. Last one on Lehman. But notice the date. And the headline is called The Survivor. And it's the New York Times front cover of the business section. And basically saying, at this point, I mean, again, I got to go back to my favorite slide. It's right here. And, Lehman is a survivor at this point. It hasn't gone down yet. But of course, even a casual glance at Lehman Brothers at this point, that fortune story that talked about 2006 didn't even mention the word mortgage. Here they absolutely cannot avoid noticing that Lehman was full of mortgage products. But they say, and again, I know this reporter, and she's really smart. This is not the issue. And these are people with great integrity, and they work very hard. Again, it's not the issue. But it says, the story says, but the bank had positioned itself well. It had been building its long-term capital since 1999. Last fall, troubled by what it saw in the mortgage market, it started to hedge its exposure against the mortgages it was accumulating. Voila. And so we'll see that this reporting is now, in retrospect, looks very checked out. And it was. And particularly when you compare it to a strain of reporting, as I sort of indicated at the beginning, there was sort of an undercurrent of reporting that was doing something completely different. So I wanted to work through this problem. Like, again, journalists of high integrity, super smart, working extremely hard, and talking about things that have absolutely nothing to do with a global crisis that's brewing at the very institution they're writing about. So again, how do we think about this? And again, I don't claim to. I'll get better at this trick later, but I don't claim to at this machine later. But maybe we can go into Broadway when I go to Broadway or something. But I don't claim this is the theory of relativity or quark, quantum physics or anything. But I thought about this problem because we had to sort of think about, well, what kind of journalism is working for us, and what is going, what missed this point. And that's where I kind of came up with this dichotomy, which I think is actually, having worked in newsrooms for a long time, this is sort of this ever-present tension in my business. And it's not about people, although certain people tended to be drawn to one type of reporting and others are drawn to it's not about institutions, although a magazine like Mother Jones might be tend to go one way than another. What I try to say in my book is that the business press, including Fortune and Forbes and Wall Street Journal, are fully capable of doing both. It's just, but these two forms of reporting are always in conflict, and there's always tension. And in this competition, one side has all the advantages over the other. Anyway, so just to sort of think about this, when I talk about access reporting versus accountability reporting, again, it has to do with these are practices that go back to Ida Tarbell and Charles Dow and Edward Jones at Dow Jones. But the thing to remember about this, the way to think about this problem is that access reporting is you're trying to get access to powerful people, get them to tell you what they're thinking or what they're about to do. As a result, you just have there's some things that just will flow from that very practice. One is that you're dealing with elite sources. You're going to be getting basically orthodox views. This is a top-down kind of type of style of reporting. audience you are speaking to are investors. It's going to be a more, and if you're going to be doing the other stuff, you're looking at a much. It's the same practice. It's the same business of journalism, but you're basically talking to an entirely different group of people. What you've done, I'm arguing, is that you've pulled the camera back. It's not like you're ignoring the powerful, but you're also taking in other. You're also involving other sources and people. So these are, rather than top executives, these would be the fired executives, or short sellers rather than long players in the market. They might be plaintiffs' lawyers, borrowers, community activists. They would be state regulators, and in fact, during this period, it was really state regulators, state banking commissioners who really had, and state attorneys general who really had a handle on this is bottom-up reporting. It's speaking to the public. It's not about niche information. It's about a mass audience, that type of thing. And again, as the muckrakers taught us, this is basically a functionalistic thing. This is for an investor. You want information so you can trade on it. This is about something else. It's about broader social themes. So I thought we needed to work with that when you're sort of thinking about when you're thinking about why our journalism could be so thorough and yet so useless. Now here's the thing. People say, in the end, there's this sort of great question hanging over this whole, my business, really. And the big question, I think, is, does any of this really matter, right? Does journalism matter? And I get that a lot, and one of the reasons I called this book The Watchdog That Didn't Bark. And one of the things I wanted to do was say it didn't bark, but I also spent a lot of time establishing the fact that when in fact journalism is deployed correctly, it actually can be a very potent watchdog in the public interest. However, not everyone agrees with this analysis, and I got this review not a couple of weeks ago by someone from the Texas Observer. You could say it was a negative review because the first 5 words are, the fundamental failure of Dean Starkman's. I saw that on my BlackBerry. I said, that's not a good start. So it goes on. The fundamental failure of Dean Starkman's The Watchdog That Didn't Bark, the financial crisis, and of mainstream journalism more generally is hidden in plain sight in the title's metaphor. Starkman explains why journalists often aren't alert watchdogs, but he can't see why limiting the profession to the role of a barking dog is quite literally a dead end. And it turns out that this is actually an anti-capitalist critique. And from a Marxist point of view, and it's actually quite interesting, he's basically saying that you have to pull the camera back even further. Not just questioning systemic problems in the business, question the capitalist system itself. It's an interesting point of view. I've been out-broadened, I said to myself. Some guys even stepped behind me. But he says this, and here's where, of course, he is wrong. You wouldn't bring him up, right? If I'm not going to lose this argument because he's not here. His name is Jensen, and I want to meet him one of these days, this guy. He says journalists should report on abuses by the powerful, of course, but of course, that's so easy, right? When I read this to some journalists, we all laughed. It's like, of course you should take on the part. It's like this kind of work pops up out of a toaster. This is very time-consuming, stressful, difficult work. But he sort of takes this as like, of course you should do it. But within what underlying analysis of the larger system? Are illustrations of these failures used to deepen our understanding of the unjust and unsustainable nature of a capitalist system? Starkman doesn't take up the question, but his answer seems to be no, since he expresses faith in, quote, effective journalism and uncompromised regulation, which, quote, operate independently but together create a dynamic that generates information, public awareness, and ultimately reform. That seems to be where the process stops for Starkman, fine-tuning reforms. So, I mean, of course, this is where I think the whole critique falls down. I mean, this is exactly what Wall Street bankers and Angelo Mozillo and people would love to hear. Oh, this reforms and white-collar crime prosecution. That's just fine tuning. But in fact, that's how we sort of fix our system. And any attempt to dismiss this is really an attempt you're really kind of missing the boat. All you're doing is waiting for waiting for the rapture when somehow there will be no abuses anywhere and this will be under some perfect system. It's not going to happen. What's interesting about this and why Jensen is actually quite wrong is this. If you look at reporting during the period when forthright investigative reporting was done about financial institutions, it had this profound effect, and that's sort of where the tragedy comes in. There was this piece that was done by the New York Times and ABC's news program 2020 in a sort of a joint venture. It started out with an anecdote about a family that had gotten fleeced on a mortgage by a very powerful subprime lender during the time called First Alliance Mortgage Company. And it says about this family called the Gundersons. It says, the Gundersons are among scores of consumers who have complained to state regulators about First Alliance, a national home equity lender based in Irvine, California. More than a dozen homeowners have already sued. They all assert that the company has used a deceptive sales pitch delivered by loan officers recruited from big auto dealerships to lure homeowners into high-cost loans that expose them to the threat of foreclosure and financial ruin. And then it's interesting, it goes on to describe all of the regulators and the regulatory trouble that this particular bank is under and all the problems it's having. But it says, but First Alliance has some very important supporters, the investment banks on Wall Street that help it raise money lent to people like the Gundersons. Those banks began raising significant amounts of money for the company in the early 1990s after it had come under investigation in California for discriminatory lending. An investigation by the New York Times in 2020 shows they have pumped hundreds of millions of dollars into First Alliance in recent years, even as civil lawsuits and state investigations have raised increasingly troubling questions about First Alliance's business practices. And if you'll indulge one more paragraph. The money raised by Wall Street for First Alliance and dozens of similar companies has financed a quiet revolution in the financial habits of millions of Americans whose low incomes or blemished credit histories otherwise prevented them from obtaining conventional loans. Such subprime borrowers, as they are called in the lending industry, have turned in increasing numbers to finance companies that cover the risk of default by charging them significantly higher fees and interest rates. Okay, so of course the punchline of this story was written in March of 2000. And what's interesting about this one was the response was almost immediate, and that's actually quite typical. When you ask whether journalism matters, in fact, I say it does, journalists and everything else, but it certainly matters to businesses who are written about, but especially in the financial business, because and most especially in the subprime business, where reputation is very important and the risk of negative publicity is very high. Why? Because these institutions all rely on lending themselves. So once their lenders cut them off, they're essentially out of business. And what happened after this story was like almost an immediate response from regulators first. The Office of Thrift Supervision moved to close some loopholes. There were 4 bills introduced in Congress to combat predatory lending. Even Alan Greenspan, who was then sort of the height of his reputation, felt compelled, a week after the Times story, felt compelled to give a speech, his first and only speech on predatory lending. He denounced it to a group of housing activists, saying, discrimination is against the interests of business, yet business people too often practice it. He announced a task force that would look into the problem. And what was really interesting about this is this. What really was the market just trembled at this story. There's a piece in it, you read, going back and reading the fallout. This trade magazine called Investors Dealers Digest had this headline: "The predatory lending fracas. Wall Street comes under scrutiny in the subprime market as liquidity suffers and regulation looms." Liquidity suffering means that people aren't buying those mortgage-backed securities that are made from subprime mortgages. Again, this was in the spring of the year 2000. And they quoted a managing director of Merrill Lynch, a guy named Rob Little, who said, "Obviously, predatory lending is a high-focused item. People are very cognizant of it. They're very cautious in terms of how they address it." All I'm saying here is this kind of story has a profound effect on Wall Street. People listen. The Wall Street banks fight them tooth and nail before publication, but they do matter. And if you go back and look at the record of reporting on banks and Wall Street, I mean, that's sort of to me, that's sort of the main tragedy of this period. I'm not arguing, right, that journalism prevents the financial crisis, but you could make a case for it, is all I'm saying. If you go back and look at exposés of companies like Fleet Financial, which is now part of Bank of America, Household Finance, Ameriquest, Conseco, all of them were sort of contained by journalism investigations, and that's sort of a bit of the tragedy that we face here, and that's why Jensen is wrong. Look, in a sense, you know, I feel like I've been writing this book for the 25 years I've been. This is my slide for trying to illustrate the difference between access and accountability. This is anyone watch CNBC? And that's Gretchen Morgenson. I'm a very big fan of hers. She's the Ida Tarbellian reporter for the New York Times. But in a sense, I've been writing this book in my head for 25 years. I've been thinking about these issues and this dichotomy. And I want to emphasize that, and I'm picking on poor Jim Cramer, who I've met a couple of times, and he's a very nice guy. All I'm saying is that what he does is not going to be sort of what is going to warn you about the financial crisis. He was the guy who said in March 2008, remember Bear Stearns is fine? Does anyone remember that quote? I should get the video because it's Bear Stearns is fine. Bear Stearns doesn't exist anymore. But again, for me, the crisis presented an interesting opportunity. First, we had this, as I say, this collapse of a central beat of American journalism, sort of right under its nose. And secondly, it came at a time, the fall of 2008, was just itself sort of the apogee of the crisis within the news business, as its own financial business models were starting to come unraveled. The internet, Google, Facebook, Craigslist had all started to take hold and do serious damage to my business. And I argue, and I believe quite strongly, it did serious damage to the production of public knowledge. So we're at this point, we're at this inflection point, and people ask me, and we can talk about it. Well, what's your solution? And I have some, but I thought it was a good time to sort of stop and look back over the course of journalism history, not just for journalists, but for everyone who reads journalism, to sort of look at, what's worked, what hasn't worked, who our forefathers and foremothers are as journalists, and figure out what we need, because if we don't know what we need, we're not going to know how to go out and get it, and that's sort of the goal today, is to figure out how we go out and get this kind of accountability reporting that we need. So thanks very much for your attention. hope.
Okay, thanks, Don. Thanks, Dean. I did want to mention that the Watchdog That Didn't Bark is available for sale, and Dean will be signing them in the back there after we're done. But first, we have a bit of time for some questions. All I ask is that you come up here to the microphone so that everybody can hear the question, and we'll go from there. So, who wants to ask a question? Okay, great. So we'll have a little line over here, please.
Topic is Bloomberg News. Their ownership has directed reporting in China to be limited to certain subjects only,
right,
so that it doesn't affect the sales of their terminals.
Right.
Their journalism is based on their own financial self-interest.
Right.
Isn't this just a continuation of what you've been talking about?
That's a brilliant point. I've got to tell you, I've been right. Thank you for that. Sorry. Thank you for that question. Yeah, because I've been immersed in this topic myself. And I hadn't really thought about it in those terms, which is kind of a little bit strange, but right. It's interesting. For those of you who don't know, Bloomberg News is a unit of Bloomberg LP, which is a financial information giant based in New York, and its main business is selling financial data via these nifty terminals that cost $2,000 a month to rent. It's a very lucrative business, and it dominates basically financial services firms, by Europe and the U.S. and now important market is China. What's interesting is to supplement, and the star of the show is this data. It's any data you want, Italian bond prices, and the currency rates, but the kroner and the Ukrainian currency going back to the turn of the something, they have it for you, and you can do all sorts of things. That's why people do it. But they also then, in the last 20 years, have grown an enormous news organization called Bloomberg News. It's bigger, twice as big as the New York Times. It's got 2,300 reporters. It's an army. Like, no one has 2,300 reporters. I think it's got to be the largest news organization in the world. And in the last few years, as the questioner indicates, they've come on with some blockbuster investigations into Wall Street, to their credit, their customers, and Chinese corruption, until this spring, when and it's all kind of dripped out, but now the story is becoming known, is that their executives basically said, we can't afford to do this. We cannot afford to do this. Now we can't afford it. They can afford to pay for it. They can't afford to alienate Chinese authorities. Otherwise, they can't sell the terminals in the market. Literally, it's unusual to see all this come out in such, excruciating detail. And I have friends at Bloomberg too. So we're only going to do this. That's the story. It's so interesting that China doesn't care about this. It's just a great question. Thank you for asking it.
Okay, my question is, are some of these reporters in an ivory tower just like the people that they report on?
Yeah, right. Yes. Great question. Also, thank you for...
Because some of the stories that broke were non-Wall Street, kind of just, in the middle of nowhere, so... Right.
I mean, the people, the reporter that I talk about, Richard Lords, was in Pittsburgh, hardly the center of... And even he wasn't at Carnegie Mellon, he was in, the streets of Pittsburgh, and the other star of my book was at the Roanoke Times. Again, these are not financial centers. And it's interesting that outsiders had the story here. Outsiders had the story. And that's, and remember the photo of Alan Greenspan testifying. I mean, Alan Greenspan, let's just say he's operating, he had a very fixed idea, firm ideology, but let's just say he's operating in good faith and consuming, a great consumer of data and information. And yet it was what kind of information was it? Who was he talking to? And when you talk about reporters, I've done this. This is a valuable practice, but it can't be the only practice. Otherwise, we're all in big trouble.
There's an argument that the most powerful financial executive in the world in the 20-year run-up to the subprime crisis was Alan Greenspan. He had his doctoral thesis for 20 years, and in that doctoral thesis, he talked about the subprime market, and real estate agent barons finally discovered it. All the federal transcripts are available. Why are no mainstream journalists holding Greenspan at least morally accountable for civil or criminal liability? I've given up on my profession, law. I was a prosecutor, and 40 years, Bill Black, who's in this area, who wrote about control fraud, who wrote the book, How to Steal from a Bank is to Own It, exposed us in 2005, and yet no lawyers, the Justice Department, and no serious journalists are following up on Greenspan.
I know, it makes you crazy. It makes me crazy. That's the, I think it's one of the reasons we get large crowds for events like this, because there's lingering sort of discontent and frustration with the outcome of this affair. And so why has no major Wall Street executive or anybody at a mortgage lender been prosecuted? And as the prosecutor should help us to understand that, and I don't understand it. And Greenspan, I would say, one of the things the press does is kind of pretty good at piling on after the fact, and after the crash, the gaze did turn to Greenspan, probably not in the detail that you're describing, and I think if more needs to come out as he tries to rehabilitate his reputation, then more reporting needs to be done. His culpability, at least if you had to kind of sum it up at this stage of reporting, is this grand florid nonfeasance, right? It was this idea that this belief he had that markets would regulate themselves. And what's interesting again, if you were a reporter on the streets of Pittsburgh or Roanoke, you knew that wasn't the case, that this was a severely unbalanced market. Economists call this asymmetrical information. One party has all the information and the power, and the other doesn't. And this particular model is in spades. And so that's why the rational expectations theory, the efficient markets theory, was not going to help you here.
Another evidence of the corruption was the fact that J.P. Morgan one division was shorting the subprime market. At the same time, another division was marketing the actual securities to individual investors. So I want to say that this corruption has gone on time immemorial, and that this corruption extends to the political structure as well, and they go hand in hand.
You and Jensen. No, but I mean, of course, one of the things that, just to pull it out of our time, what's so striking about the parallels between Ida Tarbell's time and ours is the fact that it wasn't just that these players were controlling big parts of the market, but of course the concern was that they were controlling the political system. And it's just the parallels are so striking when you think about the problem. And I lost our prosecutor, but I covered white-collar crime for many years in the 80s and 90s, and I remember, that there used to be powerful prosecutors, and Robert Morgenthau was feared in New York, and the SEC was actually struck terror, and that's why Jensen's completely wrong. The SEC people were terrified of getting a subpoena from the SEC. That was and the Justice Department and the Southern District of Manhattan. These were powerful offices. They would come down on you like a ton of bricks. You did not want to be there. That's where Jensen doesn't get that. That really was an effective criminal indictment. Is a very effective deterrent. It just is, and that the weakening of the regulatory and prosecutorial apparatus of the country is very worrisome, outcome.
Thank you so much for coming. First, I want to say that nonfeasance is the same as malfeasance in my mind.
I think it has the same, legally, I think it has the same consequences.
It's negligence. And I have a tendency to think that the niche investor over here would be interested in this type of reporting because it's a kind of insider information.
Right, it's interesting.
And when you look at the S&L crisis, we should have known to look for something like this. You look at a movie like Citizen Kane that was done years ago. The precedent has already been set. And as far as the public not being able to understand this type of reporting, after the fact, you've got people like you, people like Michael Lewis, people like Matt Taibbi, Gretchen Morgenstern, who have educated the public to be able to understand how these machinations work. And now we can understand what goes on, which actually led to a lot of the outrage that happened in 2008.
Right.
So what's the excuse now? It's like we know to look for it. We know these guys are going to do it because it's lucrative. It makes them money. They may not be doing credit default swaps, but as we speak,
Right.
they are creating other types of financial instruments to be able to manipulate the market.
Right.
To me, journalism's, it has a same problem as journalism as a whole. Financial reporting has a problem. It's the same as journalism as a whole, is that you've got sponsors, people who advertise in those magazines and newspapers. They don't want you to say something that's going to negatively impact their profit.
A lot of good points there. I'll unpack a couple. One is that the last point, we reporters we have this very high opinion of ourselves, and we would never, bend to the whims of some advertisers. But you're right in a very real sense is this, and I get this a lot. The Wall Street Journal's big advertisers are Wall Street and tech firms, and Bloomberg's big customers are Wall Street and tech firms. But I would say this, all of that is true, but it's complicated. In other words, the model, there's no perfect journalism model, period, full stop. I mean, the ideal model for me is 100% reader subscriptions. But if people paid that, it's just the problem is the subscription would be too expensive. It doesn't, so advertising has always traditionally supplemented. There's no perfect model. All I'm saying, though, is one of the reasons I stretched this narrative out over the course of the century is to show that that the level and quality of reporting ebbs and flows over time. It crested in the early 20th century. It disappeared for decades, reemerged in the late 60s, and then kind of it. I take your point that reporters will always be operating under these constraints, and it's an argument that's been made many times by very Noam Chomsky and big thinkers have agree with this point of view. And I'm not saying there's nothing to it. I'm just saying it's more to it than that, and that over time, as I try to demonstrate in this book. Despite all those constraints, despite the pressure, journalism can and has been an effective watchdog. You have to read my book to see if it convinces you.
Well, and I understand, the whole historical part of that, but I just have to say that I really had high hopes for Huffington Post. They've really been a disappointment. And when you look at people like Eliot Spitzer, if he's not making political hay out of it, he doesn't do this kind of work.
Right. Well, I mean, Spitzer would definitely be, if he was in a better position than he is today, he'd probably be a lot more active, but he can't. One thing, somebody said something interesting to me about where we are, and that was this. In 2008 or 2009, Obama takes office, and we all remember that period. Basically all hell was broken loose. All of the secrets were exposed. The firms were prostrate, and the government, there was a moment when there was an opportunity, one could say, to change the political economy of the country. That's the way you describe it. The people who are in power were vulnerable. Now, Obama administration chose not to do that. And so people are frustrated that no Huffington Post and nothing's no prosecutions. Quite true. And that kind of all goes back to that decision. And before we denounce Obama and Tim Geithner and all those people, and and it's perfectly have at it. But I think it's also important. I keep in mind there's a difference between, for instance, 1933 when Franklin Roosevelt took power in March, and Obama taking power in January of 2009. In 1933, when, of course, there was root and branch reform of the financial system that lasted for 50 years, it's important to remember that the crisis was 4 years old. When Obama came in, and the banks were already gone. There was nothing to do. There was nothing that Roosevelt could have done to save them. It was over. He had to build something from he had basically a blank slate. Obama came in, it was 15 minutes after the crisis. I mean, it was unfurling. So his decision, was, I could let it all go down and start from scratch, but I don't think, it's a very difficult, it's a very high price for everyone to pay. And just to, it would have been, it's an interesting, complex historical moment that we're going to be unraveling for a long time. But when people talk about why haven't things changed, right? Why haven't they changed like they did, in a previous, after a previous and equivalent crisis? I think you have to think about that.
Could you comment on the decline of journalism, meaningful journalism, as perhaps a function of the fact that now almost all the news media are owned by just a small handful of huge for-profit corporations in which their goal is profit, and if useful information for the citizenry in a democracy happens to slip in there occasionally, it is incidental.
It's an accident, right?
Mm-hmm, exactly. And looking at your slide here, that clearly the access way would surely be more profitable than the accountability way.
It's the easier way. It's the easier way. I mean, people would argue with that. But okay, here's my take on that. This is the next lecture. This is my next lecture. We're going to start a second lecture. No, I'm just kidding. Don't worry. I mean, here's problem number one. You're talking about for-profit companies consolidating, but here, let's just. There were all for-profit companies too, and it wasn't like a golden age, but there were 56,000 reporters running around with notebooks and pencils and tape recorders, and I mean, whatever you thought of them, there were a lot of them. And here we are now, and this is part of this disintegration of the business models of the media that we're talking about now. I happen to like reporters, and I like high reporter employment, but I also think, it's just sheer numbers are important in terms of getting information into the public domain. And when you sort of look back here, this is when newspapers were recording Google-like net income. They were getting profit margins of 30%. And you say they were for-profit companies. The New York Times company's for-profit. Dow Jones was for-profit. McClatchy, Knight Ridder. Some of them were terrible. Some of them were fantastic, actually. And many of them, but all of them were making such ridiculous profits from the Kansas City Star was a great newspaper back in the day. Still, apparently, no? Okay. I have a soft spot for that. But all of them they had literally access surplus profits to reinvest into newsrooms, and literally the news budgets were not incidental, but they were small compared to the size of That's gone, number one. That's an important thing. But what's interesting is your question is quite right. I mean, it's quite interesting to think about this, because we think about the internet as this kind of atomization of media, right? 1 million websites or 1 billion websites, and anyone can be a publisher, and it's this disintegration. And there are all these new forms. The Huffington Post is an old new media now, but there's a dozen others that we can think of. So yes, so that's one. But right beneath this picture of fragmentation has been a counter trend of consolidation. That's quite true. One of the hottest markets in media right now is local TV. It's bizarre, but they're being sold like hotcakes.
Especially, this isn't live now, but especially during elections. They make about 25 to 30% of their profits.
Yeah, it's a whole other. That's the media lecture, and we can do that. I'll come back next month, and we'll do that one. But
I just have one last comment, and that is next Tuesday night at UMKC, there's going to be an event about challenging corporate power and creating democracy, and I hope lots of people will be there, 7 p.m., Pearson Hall.
All right, get the plug in. And my book's on sale back there.
Just reaction to your chart there that you just put up.
This one here?
Yes. I don't know where the line was in 1972, 3, and 4, but that was Watergate, and that's apparently where there were enough reporters to break that story. So numbers don't seem to be, the primary.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Right.
The other thing I have is just a pragmatic question. I have, without intending to.
Now you're going to make me think about this.
I have some data that I think ought to be in the hands of an investigative journalist somewhere.
Okay.
Other than Googling investigative journalist and emailing everybody, how can I identify, locate, contact, forward this information to them? Or can I give it to you and let you do that?
Yeah, you can give it to me. I mean, I have friends who still do this. It depends on what the story is, but there are still investigative reporters on news organizations. There are whole nonprofits like the Center for Public Integrity and ProPublica that do nothing but investigations. There are people who are in that business.
What should I Google?
Center for Public Integrity, or my name, or I'll give you a card.
Okay.
And I'll put you in touch. It's got to be a good story, though.
That I don't know.
All right. Okay.
But something's fishy.
Okay, something's fishy. So that's what reporters are for. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thanks, Dean. The Watchdog That Didn't Bark is available for sale out there in the back by Barnes & Noble, and Dean will be signing copies, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, gang.